Welcome to Skeletal System lecture. We're going to start off the skeletal system by talking about the functions of our bones. So the first function is support the body. Second function is to protect organs. Third is to allow movement. Fourth is storage. And fifth is hematopoiesis or blood cell formation. So we have 5 functions. So starting with support, our body is supported by bones. All right. If we didn't have leg bones, then our torso wouldn't stay upright. Makes sense? We'd fall into like a puddle in the ground. So when we say support the body, we're talking about allows us to stand upright. It's our internal framework, okay? Second function is to protect organs, and we've talked about this before. Our skull protects our brain, our ribs protect our heart, right, and lungs. Our hips protect our reproductive organs. Third one is to attach to muscles to allow movement. So our muscles, we know, contract. Now this pen can't move by itself, but if I had a little muscle here that when it shortened, it pulled the pen up like this, right? It would act like a lever and you could pull on it. We can't move without something to pull on, because if a muscle just shortens, it doesn't actually do anything to get us moving, right? So when muscles shorten and pull bones like this, it makes our hand move or our body move. So we need bones for movement. Next is storage. We're going to store minerals and we're going to store fat in bones. The minerals is calcium and phosphorus. We talked about that last week. And then the fat is stored in the marrow cavity, which is in the center of bone. That's like what you give dogs. Like dogs eat the bone marrow out of bones. Or when you make soup, you use the marrow bones. Last one is blood cell formation or hematopoiesis. So red blood cells we talked about last week, and we said red blood cells have no nuclei in the center. There's no nucleus. So if there's no nucleus, we can't go from 1 to 2 by mitosis. So we can't make new cells. So the blood cells have to be formed somewhere else. They're formed in the red bone marrow of all of our flat bones. All right, and that's why when people have things like leukemia, they need bone marrow transplants, because they need to actually change out their bone marrow so they can make cells that are better. Next is the bones of the body. So in a human adult skeleton, we have 206 bones. There are 2 different types of bones that you can have. You can have compact bone, which compact bone, let me write on this so that you can see it, is actually this bone right here, that hard outside layer. That's compact bone. That's what we looked at when we looked under the microscope at bone tissue. We were looking at compact bone. All right, so this is going to be hard. It's going to be all the same, and it's going to add strength to our bone. Where the second type of bone is spongy bone. That's this middle area. So our spongy bone is usually found in short bones, okay? It's in flat bones in between the compact bone. That's what this is a picture of, is a flat bone. And our spongy bone has all these little holes in it. Your book says it's small needle-like pieces of bone, but really it's like these holes. It almost looks like a sponge, like you'd use in the kitchen. That's why it's called spongy bone. So they're going to be what spongy bone is made out of, and our spongy bone is actually lots of times filled with our red bone marrow. Spongy bone also has many open spaces and lets bone be lighter. Next, we have classification of bone. I know it doesn't say this on this slide, but there are 4 different types of bones. They can be classified as long bones, flat bones, irregular bones, or short bones. So if we go to the next slide. So when we talk about classifications of bones, our first one we're going to look at is long bone. So all of these bones in red on this picture, these ones, are all of our long bones. So these are typically longer rather than they are wide. They have a head on each end. They have a shaft in the middle, so that's kind of like the long part of the bone. They contain mostly compact bone, so that outside hard part is compact bone. And this is going to be most of the bones of our appendages when we look at long bone. That's what we're going to be looking at, is the bones of our appendages. Okay. Then we have short bone. So short bones are bones that are short. They're usually cube-shaped. All right, these ones are made up of mostly spongy bone. This is going to be the bones of our wrist, the bones of our ankles, and then there's one special type of short bone, which is called a sesamoid bone. Okay, we're talking about that here. This is going to be this bone right here. all right, is our sesamoid bone, and that's the patella. That's the bone that's your kneecap, all right? And this is called the sesamoid bone because it's made within a tendon, which is kind of a strange example or a strange way for a bone to be made. It doesn't actually like touch another bone. Next, we have flat bones. So flat bones are flat. They're thin. Lots of times they're curved. So this is that picture from earlier where we had like the 2 layers of compact bone, spongy bone in the middle. Sorry, that's going to be a flat bone. So this picture over here shows us all of our flat bones in red. So it's going to be your skull, your ribs, your hips, your sternum or your breastbone. Those are all going to be flat bones. Last one is an irregular bone. Irregular bones are oddly shaped. They don't fit into any of the other categories of bone, so that's why we call it an irregular bone. So this would be like your vertebrae. This would be your sphenoid bone in your skull. There's like a funny shaped bone that looks like a bat in your skull. It's called the sphenoid bone. That's irregular. It's not any of them. Your hip bones, which are like weirdly curved, they don't really fit into any of the categories. So that's an irregular bone. So next we come up to typical long bone structure. So this is a long bone like we talked about before. It's going to be longer than it is wide, all right? And all long bones have a typical structure that you are responsible for knowing, all right? So the picture is what I really need you to focus on. The definitions are on the left-hand side, but the picture is what you have to be able to redraw or label. So when we look at this, we have epiphysis and diaphysis. Those are the first two that I can easily see. So your diaphysis is this one. It's going to be the center of the bone. That's the shaft of the bone is another way to say it. All right, it makes up the bone's length. Then you have your epiphysis on each end, where your epiphysis is the end of the bone. All right, the epiphysis, each epiphysis is separated from the diaphysis by the epiphyseal line. Do you see that? The epiphyseal line is going to be the area where there's hyaline cartilage, where the bone grows from. We talk about that on the next slide in a little more detail. Then on our ends of our bone, we have articular cartilage. Articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage. We talked about hyaline cartilage covering the ends of bones. This is where it does it, okay? And articular cartilage is the cartilage that makes it so that bones smoothly go over one another. So like your shoulder is going to rotate in the socket because of the articular cartilage, right? And that's the cartilage that gets worn away when people have arthritis, okay? So that's this part. Next, more about your long bone, okay? Here's where we get to our epiphyseal line and our epiphyseal plate. This is the same picture that we looked at before. So your epiphyseal plate is going to be when there's hyaline cartilage in this space right here. And it's commonly known as your growth plate. That's what you guys would call it, right? That's what your parents would call it. Now, this growth plate is where your bone gets longer from that growth plate. Once the growth plate seals, it's called an epiphyseal line, and then you're no longer growing. That's why your doctors can tell in an x-ray if you're still growing or not. Okay. And remember, the epiphyseal plate and line separate your epiphysis from your diaphysis. Now, after that, we're going to have our marrow cavity or medullary cavity right here, which is going to be the middle, this area in here. All right, that's where your yellow marrow is going to be stored. The medullary cavity is lined by an endosteum, which is going to be the inside lining of that, almost like where the red that I just drawn in would be. Okay. One more thing, I think I skipped it on the last one. The periosteum, this is the membrane that lines the outside of the bone. So you have a membrane around the whole outside of the bone, that's the periosteum. Then you have a membrane on the inside of the bone, which is the endosteum. Okay. For your marrow cavity, this is where you're going to store your yellow marrow, which is fat, or your red marrow, which is used to make red blood cells. Next. Then we get to the microscopic anatomy of a bone. So we did the big parts. Now let's look at the little parts. And this we've done before. At least we've done the first, I don't know, this one, this one, this one, this one, and that one. Okay, we've done up to there. So when, oh, it all went away. We've done up to, let's try that again, here. All right, so osteon is the circle. Think of the ring of a tree that you look at when you look through the microscope. Okay, so the osteon is the whole circle. The Haversian canal is the center. We know that. It carries our blood vessels. The osteocytes are our bone cells, right? The osteocytes, right, because a site means cell. We've also learned that last time, right? And the osteocytes are going to sit in a lacuna. We know that, right? The lacuna is their house. It's where they sit because the matrix is too hard, so they need a place where they can grow and get their nutrients. This is our new stuff. The lacuna are arranged in rings called lamellae. So this right here is a lamellae. This right here is a lamellae. Those circles are called lamellae. And then, remember when we drew those tiny lines when we drew it? These tiny lines right there, are called caniculi. And what those are is tiny little canals that attach the bone cells to each other so that you can then pass nutrients and waste kind of like through that hard matrix of bone. It works. Next, we have bone marking, and this I think is on the next 3 slides, maybe 2 slides. We have a table that you can just read through. I don't need to read you the table, all right? But bone markings are features on the surface of a bone. Okay, they provide sites for attachments for ligaments, tendons, muscles. They also are passageways for nerves and blood vessels. All the foramen are going to be passageways for nerves and blood vessels. They gave you the hint: a projection or a process comes out, a depression or a cavity goes in, and lots of times the T terms are going to be projections and the F terms are going to be depressions. So go through the next 2 slides and read those. You're responsible for all of these words because that's what we're going to use for the practical. Lastly, for this lecture, we have fractures. So a fracture is just a break in the bone. There are 2 different types. You can have a closed fracture or a simple fracture, or an open fracture, which is a compound fracture. Okay? Simple versus compound tells us which one's more difficult to deal with. So closed fractures do not penetrate the skin. The skin remains closed. In an open fracture, we're going to penetrate or break the skin. We're going to break the skin. The bone is going to stick out. That is a compound fracture. When you look and you see bone, compound fracture, that's a bad one. Okay, because now we're into the world and we get all the germs from in the world into our bone. Never good. The different types of fractures that you can get are all listed down here. Read them. Not difficult. You guys can handle that. If you have questions about all that, you can ask me tomorrow in class. All right. Thank you for listening.